Hi, my name is Sydney.
And my name is Jerry. Today we are going to be talking about Southern Africa.
We'll start by going over its history in the 15th to 18th century.
In the late 1400s, the Portuguese first arrived in southern Africa. They seized its wealthy yet separated cities and settled at Mozambique and Sofala. Upon their arrival, the Portuguese faced opposition from many local communities. Additionally, the amount of wealth they had gained from the gold trade was far less than what they had expected. The settlement of the Portuguese was the start of the slave trade in this region, an act that proved to be a continuity for most of southern Africa's history.
The Dutch settled at the Cape of Good Hope in the 17th century, causing conflict with the Portuguese in the region. In the 16th century, the Cape was a regular port for European ships trading copper, beads, and tobacco for cattle with the local people. The Cape settlers called themselves the Boers, and by the end of the 18th century, they outnumbered the Portuguese. The settlers all began to speak Dutch and practice Calvinism, creating cultural uniformity and a sense of group identity. They then began to call themselves Afrikaners.
Despite this, class divisions were still present. The merchants and company servants lived in Cape Town, while the wealthy, who used to use slave labor, lived in neighboring farming districts.
The slave population increased with the settler population. Because they were divided in their origin and were scattered to different geographical locations, the slave population did not develop a uniform culture or carry out sufficient rebellions. As Encyclopedia Britannica says, by the late 18th century, in the Cape, most blacks were servants and most Europeans were masters.
In the beginning of the 19th century, the Napoleonic Wars broke out, causing the British to be in control of the Cape as they wanted to protect their sea route to India. During this time, there were many campaigns against slavery, eventually causing the British to abolish the slave trade in 1807. Encyclopedia Britannica says that the displacement of Dutch East India Company rule by an imperial state in the early stages of its industrial revolution greatly expanded local opportunities for trade and increased demands for labor, just as the slave trade was abolished in the British Empire.
However, slavery still persisted. Ivory was considered the most important export. As the slave trade continued, a large number of people, who were mostly women, were removed from their social settings. In the 18th and 19th century, it is estimated that a third of the slaves who were exported to the Americas were from Agnolia, a southern African nation.
Besides ivory, rubber was a large export for southern Africa in the late 1800s and early 1900s. However, it was not all good. As Encyclopedia Britannica puts it, although the rubber trade was successful in the short term, excessive collection of wild rubber destroyed an irreplaceable natural resource, while new concentrations of population upset the ecological balance of a drought-prone environment.
Christianity also played a key role in the development of southern Africa. Missionaries from Europe brought over Christianity to the people they colonized, creating notions of civilization and progress. This progress was shown by the multitude of agricultural products, such as ivory and rubber, that were used in export in order to become part of the labor market. These missionaries went after most of the traditional African culture, developing an ideology that went along with the submission of the locals to the colonizers. Thus, syncretism between these new Christian missionaries and traditional African religions did not really exist.
One continuity that has been in Africa from 1450 to 1900 is that the Africans were always viewed as culturally inferior.
In the new colonial empires, race was a prominent point distinguishing ruler from the ruled. Racism was especially pronounced in areas with a large number of European settlers.
As Strayer says on page 785, Europeans increasingly used the prestige and apparatus of science to support their racial preferences and prejudices.
That was during the scramble for Africa, but Africa was viewed as culturally inferior going back all the way to the slave trade.
During the slave trade, as Strayer says on page 618, Europeans tried to exploit African rivalries to obtain slaves at the lowest possible cost.
The idea of Africans seeming inferior plays into the idea of Eurocentrism.
Patriarchy also persisted in Africa during this time period.
The colonizers and the slave traders took pride in masculinity and viewed the colonized Africans as feminine and soft.
While there were many continuities in Africa during this period, there was also one big change.
At first, Africa was wanted for the people, but then Africa was wanted for its resources.
From the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade in the 15th century and until the end of it in the 19th century, Africa was wanted for its people to be used as slaves.
As Strayer says on page 612, the Europeans took an estimated 12.5 million people from African societies and shipped them across the Atlantic.
Africans were targeted and chosen based on their race, and they were viewed as culturally inferior because of their skin color.
Africa's main export was the slaves during the Atlantic slave trade. People had no interest in Africa or their crops. Their main focus was their people.
Even before the Atlantic slave trade, there was still slavery of Africans. It was just from tribe to tribe.
All of this changed when the scramble for Africa started in 1875, and the Africans were now wanted for their resources.
As Strayer says on page 795, the growing integration of colonized societies into a world economy that increasingly demanded their gold, diamonds, copper, tin, rubber, coffee, cotton, sugar, cocoa, and many other products.
African land was sought after. The focus was moved from people to land.
Colonial rule had a deep impact on people's ways of working.
Asian and African merchants were squeezed out by Europeans, and many colonial states demanded unpaid labor on public projects.
The worst abuse was in the Congo Free State with King Leopold of Belgium.
Europeans took over huge tracts of African land, employing Africans as workers. This made for poor working conditions. People were still exploited later on. They were just exploited in order to get the resources in Africa.
Africa was colonized by the British like the Americans were, and it was a very similar type of colonization.
Europe was in competition between other European countries to colonize Africa. In the Americas, the competition was driven by rivalries stemming from increased nationalism.
The Europeans imposed their will on the weaker colonies with military and economic power and made them feel as if they were culturally inferior. And even the Europeans brought diseases to the places they colonized.
The people who were being colonized were unhappy with their European imperial powers, and there was more direct European control of their colonies.
Europeans thought they were superior and viewed their colonies as culturally inferior, and this again ties into the idea of Eurocentrism.
These maps highlight the areas that the British colonized in both Africa and North America. These images show the similar British colonization in these two regions.
As Jihan Zhao says in her article, the emphasis was on developing the resources for export.
Even though the colonization of Africa was similar to America, it was different from Latin America.
The colonization differed to the extent in which the imperial powers had control over the colonies, and it differed because of who was doing the colonizing.
In Africa, it was all the European countries competing and scrambling for Africa. In Latin America, it was only the Spanish and the Portuguese.
The imperial powers also had a far greater cultural influence on Latin America than they did in Africa, where they had little lasting impact.
The Latin American colonies adapted the language, religion, and traditions of their imperial power, while Africa maintained its own customs and traditions.
This allowed for syncretism to happen in Latin America while preventing it in Africa.
As Kittleson says in an article, the Spaniards, however, immediately started moving in the direction of their own traditions, while they conquered Latin America.
That's it for this episode. See you in the next one.